Thank you, Dr. Denis Nobel, for your nice presentation. Appreciate it very much. So I'd like to ask you to clarify, as many people get an impression in common people that DNA has a very special power inside the cell, and as if it is mechanically controlling a cell by what you can say, its representation as a functional or informatic molecule. So I always try to give example when I present to the students from what we learn from our teachers, that hand does not do anything. It is the person who is using the hand to many things, writing or shaking the hand and things like that. So what we have learned from the advanced cellular biology, that the cell is doing the things which looks as if magical. The molecules are talking inside the cell, but the molecules that have inside the cell by themselves don't have that capacity to do by themselves. Those are miracles. So we want to know your view on that, and also to get some clarification. Like we have a robot, there are some program. Do we still believe that there are some hidden codes and programs which actually controls various functions of the organism, like biologist gene or a religionist gene and things like that?
I like all of those questions. They are the ones we take up directly in the book, Understanding Living Systems. The answers are very simple. DNA was described as the book of life. DNA was described as the program of life. DNA has been described as what creates us, body and mind. That is Dawkins' view. I debated with Richard Dawkins a year ago. He couldn't deal with any of the points that I made, showing that molecular biology itself, not high-level biology like mine, but molecular biology itself has deconstructed those false conclusions. There is no book of life in the DNA. There is no program of life in the DNA. I'm a computer programmer. That's how I produced the rhythm mechanism of the heart as a calculation back in 1960. I used a very primitive valve-based computer, one of the earliest computers available for people to use. I used that in order to show that it was possible for the cell voltage to interact with the membrane channels to produce the rhythm. And I did that by programming. Now, what you have in programs is choices, because you have to allow for different possibilities. If this happens, then that. If not, then something else. You need what I call those if, then, else clauses. You will look through the sequence of C's, G's, A's, and T's until you're completely silly looking through the C, G's, A's, and T's. You will never find a sequence that is the equivalent of if, then, else. There are no choices in the genome. There are switches. Each gene coding part of the DNA has a structure close to it, which, if activated by the rest of the cell, notice that it's the living cell that does it. If activated by the rest of the cell, enables that gene to start informing the ribosomes in the cell to produce the protein necessary for that function. But that's not something that the gene does without being activated from the high-level property of the cell as a whole. So the functionality comes at a different level. It's not at the level of the nucleus. The nucleus is just a membrane that surrounds the DNA and holds the DNA tightly bound together in its chromosomes, usually. and just liberates little bits of it when you need to make more protein. That's all it is. It's the end of story. It is not what creates life. Now, I think for roughly 20 years since the sequencing of the genome, the first sequencing of the human genome in 2001, we've all labored under the illusion, because it is an illusion, that that promise will one day be satisfied, that people will find that program in the DNA and show how it works to create the organism. What they've been presented with from that study at University College London that I referred to, just recently published in the British Medical Journal, is that it's useless, even at predicting which diseases we're going to have. You can go to 23andMe and many other companies and pay maybe $1,000 and get your genome fully sequenced. It might tell you you've got a distant aunt in somewhere like India or Australia, but it won't tell you what diseases you're going to have. And that's what the study shows. So I say I'm sorry, because we've wasted 20 years when we could have been focusing at the level at which it's possible to understand health and disease. That's higher levels of the organism. And we didn't do that. We chose to spend all the money on sequencing as many genomes as possible. And we've ended up with the result that it doesn't tell us what makes us work. What makes us work as organisms is us. It is our cells, our tissues, our organs, and even the organism as a whole. Because remember, I put the sociotype at the top of that inverted triangle of causation. The really important decisions in life, like who are you going to marry? What kind of religion do you want to adopt? Do you want to adopt one at all? Or do you want to go on a holiday this way or that way? All these decisions are social decisions. They've got nothing to do with what genes you've got. Yes, there will be a propensity for people with particular kinds of genes to go one way or the other. But that's just probability. It doesn't tell you what will happen. So I think we can state categorically now that the idea that there is a program in the DNA and that those genes created us body and mind is simply illusion. It's fairy tale. And that's what the selfish gene is. It's a fairy tale. Actually, I told that to Richard Dawkins last year, and he replied saying, but Denis, if you're right, I and many others have been wrong for 50 years. I just nodded my head. Enough said.
Thank you, Dr. Denis Noble. I want to ask you why still the focus in biology is more on molecules, because we don't find the nature that you have suggested as organism possess, the religion, love, affection, all those things, properties, the subjective experiences, they are not coming from the physical properties or the chemical equations. There it is not represented, the happiness, unhappiness, love, or even knowing, even learning from the mistake what bacterium display. These qualities are not coming from those molecules. And why in biology we are still focused on molecules than finding a new way of representing life, or finding new terminology?
Well, I would respond to that by saying, first, let's give praise where it is due. The molecular revolution in biology, starting around 1950, well, exactly when you date it is arguable, but anyway, certainly coming to great fruition during the 1950s, when the double helix was first worked out, and when many other molecular processes were developed, such as how genes are read, how they're transcribed to create proteins, the one-way process of DNA to RNA to proteins, all of that. Let's give praise to the people who did that. They produced correct information, but it was misinterpreted for over 50 years, and particularly the idea of what is called the central dogma of molecular biology, which is the idea that because a DNA creates an RNA, which then is enabling a ribosome to make a particular protein, that there is a natural causation from the DNA through to the proteins, and therefore, because the proteins are the workhorses of the body, to what the body does. But I'll tell you this, if I exercise, as I do, I go and I spend exercising, doing walking, dancing, you name it, because I'm old enough to need to do that. You need to keep well. And exercise is one of the best ways of keeping well. What happens? If I maintain that, my muscles grow. How does that happen? That happens because that decision to exercise in that way leads to the exercise itself, which then sends messages to the right part of the genome to make more protein, actin and myosin, that enables muscles to move. All of that is correct. But does it tell you which way you will run? Does it tell you who you're going to meet? No, of course it doesn't. All it tells you is you will get more muscle made if you exercise, and that's all it will do. And so it's limited to what the central dogma actually states, which is that DNA leads to RNA, leads to proteins. And if you activate that process, you will get more of that particular protein. That's fine. But that certainly does not tell you where you will find the person you love, where you will find the person who you need, because you need a carpenter, for example, nor where you should go to have dinner with somebody. All of that is at a higher level of organization. So I think we should praise the founders of molecular biology for the brilliant discoveries they made. Without understanding the double helix, we wouldn't really understand how DNA gets replicated. Without understanding the processes of how RNAs are made and how that enables proteins to be made, we wouldn't be able to pursue possible ways in which we can cure diseases that depend on that process being much more functional. So, yes, praise where it is due, but the terrible misunderstandings that arose from taking the central dogma of biology to mean seriously what Richard Dawkins states, they, genes, made us body and mind, that is where the mistake is.
I want to emphasize something that is our Vedantic view is there is a gross body and there is subtle body. So these all protein that how it is synthesized, all this understanding more to do with the gross body, which in Vedic science is known as Pancha Mahabhuta: earth, water, fire, air, ether. This is basically the bodily constituent that we call about atoms, molecules, macromolecules, all those things. But what organism also displays the mind. In Vedantic sense, there are three more elements. They call it mind, intellect, and false ego. So at least there is some sense of mind. Some biologists have started to talk about as far as cell is concerned, as if cell does things as if it has some mind. The proofreading and stuff like that. So to address mind, only gross explanation or a study at the plane of gross level is not seems to be sufficient. So to include more subtle terminology which are being addressed in philosophy and religion is also taken into consideration if at all we want to address or justify the study of life.
I like that question very much indeed, because I think the mind obviously is in principle at that level I call the sociotype, and even bacteria have a sociotype, and certainly all single cell eukaryote organisms have a sociotype. They work out which organisms they can cooperate with and which they can't. So yes, it has to be at the level of the sociotype, and as I said, even single cells partake in a sociotype. Bacteria communicate to each other when they're hungry and when they're not, and they will let others know when they can reproduce and when it will be difficult. All of that is understood. I think on the question, though, where is the mind? I actually turn in my little book, The Music of Life, to the Oriental philosophical tradition for what I see as an easier explanation than Descartes' explanation given 300 or 400 years ago here in the West. Descartes thought we had to suppose there was a separate fuzzy thing, the soul, that communicates somehow or another with the brain. Well, we've never found that, and nor will we ever do so, because we come back now to what is happening at that high level. It's what I call conditioned arising, and some of you will recognize that already as Taoist, Vedantic, and Buddhist philosophy. It is the idea that at a high enough level of organization, all components of the system enter into determining what happens next. It is the process of conditioned arising. In Taoism, there's a very famous text from about 3,000 years ago that explains the idea. In Buddhism, of course, there's the no self concept, which I think is also found in other Indian traditions. I'm not a great expert on these Oriental traditions, but I do see them as having rich insights, which unfortunately here in the West we have ignored. And that's largely because we were impressed, I think, by Descartes' mechanism. He was living in a century, the 17th century, which was very impressed with the mechanical objects that looked like living organisms in the gardens of the rich. You know, they even moved their hands like this. They even spoke, making mouthing noises and so on, all because of water being pumped through tubes that made the bodies move. And he thought everything has to be like that. He thought that fluid coming down a nerve would make a muscle expand and therefore contract, and so on and so forth. Of course, none of that is true. As soon as we found the electrical properties of nerves and muscles, we had no longer any need for Descartes' ideas. But his idea, and he wrote in 1665 in his treatise on the fetus, if I knew what was in that sperm, I would be able mathematically and with certainty to predict what would happen to the organism. There you have it. Even 350 years ago, the central dogma of molecular biology, which has been so badly misinterpreted as to think that that would be possible. It's just not possible. And as I said, the study by University College London in its recent investigation of the role of polygenic scores in predicting the human shows that Descartes was completely wrong. But we've had to wait 350 years before that test was done. It fails.
So now I'd like to thank this nice exchange and mention that Dr. Noble will be joining us at the end of the conference for the interdisciplinary dialogue. So any other questions for Dr. Noble or the dialogue amongst the speakers themselves as we continue to hear the ideas being presented today, we'll be able to have more of that later on. So we thank everyone and just like to transition now with Dr. Sumangala to our